Hello and welcome to my second YouTube video. Today I'm going to talk about a plant family that I really love, although I realize I'm one of the few people probably. It's the family of the stinging nettles. You might recognize some plants here, like for example the Chinese money plant, and might be surprised that these actually belong to the same family as the stinging nettle, but I'll explain all about that later. I'm in the greenhouse of the Botanical Garden of Leiden again. We have a funny type of frog that lives here, so if you hear a strange whistling sound in the background, it's the frog. Well, I start with the most horrible stinging nettle of them all. It's this one. This is Dendrocnide moroides, also known as the gympie-gympie. It's a tropical stinging nettle from Australia. It can also be found in parts of New Guinea, and it's known to be the most painful plant in the world. It's so painful that some women which have been stung heavily by this plant claim that it's even more painful than giving birth. There's even one case known of a soldier who killed himself after he was stung by this plant. It's a weird story because he was in the jungle and he had to go to the toilet. Of course, toilet and toilet paper are scarce in the jungle, so he used these soft looking leaves instead. And the sneaky thing about this plant is that the hairs that will sting you are almost invisible, and they also take a few seconds before you actually realize you are stung. But once you realize you are stung, oh boy, it will be heavy. And in the case of this man who rubbed it all over the place, he probably didn't know what happened to him, and he sadly committed suicide because of that. The pain is not everlasting though. It usually takes a few hours, and then after a while it moves to your lymph nodes, which are close to the place where you've been stung, and then it disappears, you think. But every time you touch something cold, the pain will come back on the place where you've stung. It's just for a few seconds, but this effect can actually last for a few months. So this plant is notorious. It makes beautiful fruits though. They look like raspberries and you can actually eat them, although they are not super tasty. They taste like a very crispy, lousy watermelon. They are okay, but not worth picking, because if you're not careful, one of the hairs can still be stuck on the fruit and you can actually get stung inside your mouth. So it's not recommended to try it. The next plant I'm going to show you is this one. This is Urticaceae ferox. Ferox means ferocious, and that's exactly what this plant is. You can actually see the spines of this plant very easily, and although it's less painful than the gympie-gympie, it is said that people can get very allergic from this one and get into shock. So this is actually more dangerous than that one. That's why we have to keep this plant behind bars in the botanical garden, because the risk of some visitor touching this plant is one that we would never want to take. Okay, when we covered all the horrible stinging nettles, let's move to the nice ones. I think one of the coolest plants from the stinging nettle family is this plant. This is Soleirolia, also known as baby tears, and I was actually surprised when I found out that this was a relative of the stinging nettle. It doesn't sting. Some reports say that it can sting, although I've tried and I've tried and I've tried, and I've never succeeded to be stung by this one, but if it stings, it will probably be extremely mild. This plant, although I thought this was a tropical plant, actually isn't. This plant is native to the Mediterranean area. You can find it wild on the islands of Mallorca, Corsica, Sardinia, and even on mainland Italy. So that also means that this plant is quite hardy. Here in the Netherlands we experience frost in the winter. It's not a lot, but for example -10°C can happen. And that means that this plant is completely hardy here. It doesn't like bright sun and it doesn't like a very dry environment, but in some places in the city you can find this plant naturalized, as if it's native there. I once went to Mallorca, and one of the reasons why I went there was to see this plant in nature, because even though this is very common in the horticultural trade, it's quite rare in nature, especially on Mallorca. So I was really thrilled and excited when I found it, even though my friend who lives there found it a little bit silly, because why did I went all the way to Mallorca to see such a tiny plant? But I think finding a plant which is famous as a houseplant in the wild is always something magical. So I love doing that. Okay, the next one is probably the most famous one of all the stinging nettles. It's this one, the Chinese money plant, or Pilea peperomoides. I think this plant needs little introduction because social media has been bombarded with this plant. Although it's very interesting that a few years ago this plant was quite rare and expensive and everybody showed their plant. And now it's common and cheap, and suddenly they disappeared from Instagram. I think it's sad, you know, when you love a plant, and don't only love it because it's a hype. This plant is native to China, where it grows on vertical rock crevices. And this is also something that you have to keep in mind when you want to grow it successfully, because it doesn't like a big pot, it doesn't like a lot of root space. So grow it in a small pot, but make sure that you water it well, and then it will be okay. The next one I will show is this one. This is Pilea mollis. It's also a Pilea, just like this one, and it's not surprising because Pilea is the largest genus in the family of the stinging nettles. It looks entirely different, and like this one, it's also getting very popular, but this one is a little bit on its decline, and this one is in the rise at the moment. So the plants, like a plant like this one, is actually quite expensive. I bought this in a local garden center, and it was 13 euros for a plant like this, which is quite strange because they are so easy to reproduce. All you have to do is take off a branch, remove the lower two leaves, and cut all the other leaves in half. The reason why you cut the leaves in half is because you basically remove all the roots from the cutting, so it has difficulties absorbing water. But the leaves, on the other hand, evaporate water, so you bring back the balance. The plant is not able to absorb a lot of water, so make sure that it also cannot evaporate a lot of water. And another thing you can do to help prevent this is to place the cutting in a place with a very high humidity. So for example, a propagator or a transparent plastic bag. You can propagate it in water, but well, you know, that's a personal thing. I do not like making cuttings on water because I think it's more work. First you have to make the cutting on water, then it makes roots. And then you have to be very careful to transplant these roots in the soil because they are very brittle. And also there's a risk that the water roots that are formed in the water will not adapt very well to the soil, so they die and it has to make new roots again. So when you make a cutting straight away in the soil, when it makes roots, it's ready to go. Well, if there is one thing that Urticaceae are not famous for, it's for making beautiful flowers. And this is because they are wind pollinated. That means that there are no birds or insects involved in taking the pollen from one plant to another. So why waste all your energy on making beautiful petals or even nectar? This, however, does not mean that the flowers are not interesting. If you take, for example, the Soleirolia again, this plant makes separate male and female flowers, and the male flowers make 4 anthers which catapult their pollen into the air. When the wind comes, it makes it easy for the wind to take the pollen away, but even if there is no wind, the pollen will fall down and hopefully find a female flower of the same plant and pollinate the flower. Well, I hope this video will make you appreciate stinging nettles a little bit more. Maybe it's through their non-stinging relatives, or maybe you love the horrible gympie-gympie. But knowing that these plants are related to each other, I think is super interesting. So I'm going to do a video on plant families and why names keep changing in the future. But until then, I want to thank you for watching and hopefully see you next time.